Hi, everybody. Welcome to your first pre-recorded lecture. So I'm going to try to keep these in chunkable pieces. So please feel free to pause the lecture if you need to take notes. And remember to please take notes and write down any questions or any content that you need more clarification on. And we'll talk about that in our live session on Tuesday. Okay. All right. So what we're going to talk about today is basic chemistry. Hold on just a second. Okay. Captions are on. Okay, so let's talk about our basic chemistry. Why do we bother looking at this when we're in a plant class, right? I told you guys the first couple of lectures we have, the first couple of weeks are all general biology basics, and these are important pieces that you need to know, just foundational pieces of knowledge to help you understand how plants function. So hang in there and let me know if you need clarification on anything. But we want to include chemistry in biology because understanding how molecules and atoms interact with one another is a really big part of understanding biological function. Some of this may be review for you. If it is not review for you and you need more resources, then awesome. Just reach out and let me know. Our general overall structure of life can be broken down into all of these different components. So we'll spend a lot of time on plant organs and cells and tissues when we get to those parts of this lecture, of this class. But this is the general organization of all of these things. You have your very small at the bottom over here in your lower right-hand corner, which is your atoms. That is the smallest unit of matter. And then you have molecules and all the way up here, okay, to macromolecules, which will be your next set of lectures, organelles, cells, tissues, organs. Organs can be also divided into organ systems, organisms, populations, communities, ecosystems, and biospheres. So all of this over here, all of these big pieces, those are all pieces that we're going to cover towards the end of class when we talk about ecosystems and trophic interactions. So we're going to spend the first part of the semester talking about these pieces over here. Okay, but this is the general overview of the organization of life. So again, everything on Earth, living or not, is made up of matter. And so the chemical reactions that happen through different molecules are the foundation for all life. So everything ends up breaking down into chemistry. That's an important thing to understand. We'll start with atoms. Those are the fundamental building blocks of matter. Atoms cannot be broken down into simpler substances. I will say that there is a lot of work on subatomic particles, which are these protons, neutrons, and electrons that you see down here. So even though these are the building blocks, there is a lot of research around these subatomic particles here. And as of right now, atoms cannot be broken down into simpler substances by chemical means. There are lots of research around moving those through. So the structure of your atom is very simple. You have a nucleus in the center here, and your nucleus contains your protons and your neutrons. Your protons are going to be positively charged, and your neutrons have no charge at all. And then on the outside, you see these little subatomic particles here. Those are electrons. Electrons carry a negative charge and are orbiting around the nucleus. Do not confuse the nucleus of the atom with the nucleus of a cell. The word nucleus is referring to the center portion of the cell, or the center portion of the atom. In a cell, the nucleus is referring to where the genetic material is held in a eukaryotic cell. Where do all these atoms come from? They come from star stuff. So you are actually made of star stuff. If you've heard people say that, you are actually made of star elements. Hydrogen in the centers of stars are fused to helium atoms, and then when stars explode, then heavier elements such as carbon and oxygen are formed. So all of these elements are released into the universe when these stars explode or form these planetary nebula. Really cool stuff. So I talked about this just a second ago, but here's your overview. Your protons are positive. This subatomic particle determines the element. So when we say element, we're talking about a singular atom, okay? And that proton determines what the element is. Then you have your neutrons that have no charge, neutral charge in the middle. And then you have your electrons, which have a negative charge. These are the atomic particles that are involved in chemical reactions and forming molecules. And then your nucleus consists of neutrons and protons. So again, another way to look at this here, a different diagram. In this diagram, we call these types of diagrams Bohr models. Looking for my text here. The Bohr model is just a way to show where the electrons are at in their orbitals. And Bohr, it's named after the person who identified that. Your electrons in this model look two-dimensional, but actually your electrons are moving around the nucleus in a wide variety of different orbitals. We don't spend a lot of time on orbitals in this class because it's not a chemistry class, but kind of think of your atoms, your nucleus being surrounded by 3D movement of those electrons. The properties of elements depend on the atomic structure, so that tells us what it will do and why. So the positioning of the electrons of the atom and how they interact with other atoms tells us its behavior. So how do we know the periodic table? You look at this, how is all of this organized? All of your periodic table has a set of rules that it is organized by, and you see these different numbers in a periodic table. They tell us about the atom itself or the element. So this top number up here is the atomic number, and that is your number of protons. So that's how many protons each element has. So remember, we were talking about earlier about what determines the element. There it is, atomic number. Then you have your element symbol in the middle here, and then you have a mass number here. The mass number is how much mass an element has, and this is your number of protons plus your number of neutrons. So in order to find out how many neutrons something has, you're going to subtract your atomic number here from your mass number, right? Because your mass number includes both protons and neutrons. So if I gave you this element here, carbon, and asked you how many neutrons it had, it would be 6, okay? because 12 minus 6 is 6. So that's how you figure that out. The other thing is this atomic number, the number of protons, this tells you also how many electrons there are. So your elements have a overall neutral charge, okay, by themselves. And so because of that neutral charge, those positive protons have to be balanced out by negative electrons. So the atomic number not only tells you the number of protons, but also infers the number of electrons. So your carbon element is going to have 6 electrons total. Okay, and we'll talk about electron fields in a minute. So you want to be able to identify important information on the periodic table. If you want to know how the periodic table is organized, there's some really cool resources I can give you, but there is a rhyme and a reason to how all of these elements are placed on the periodic table. So metals are joined together in one area, and then they are ranked based on their atomic mass and are from top to bottom and right to left have a set of rules that go with them. You're not responsible for knowing that in this class, but if you're curious, let me know and I'll send you some resources on it. Okay, so you should be able to identify important information from the periodic table, draw the nucleus with the correct number of protons and neutrons in it, and then draw the concentric circles or that Bohr model with the correct number of electrons in each orbital. Okay, so if we were going to draw carbon, we would have, okay, this is awesome drawing, right? Carbon has 6 electrons. So the way that the electrons work is they have the first shell. So we call these orbital shells. And the orbital shells are where the electrons orbit. Okay. Again, it's a 3D thing. There's a variety of different kinds of orbitals, but for our specific purposes here, this is the only model that we're going to be using. We're not going to get into the S and P orbitals in this class. So the electrons are distributed around the nucleus in a specific way, and they follow what we call the octet rule. This octet rule says that your first orbital shell, which is this inner shell here, can contain 2 electrons. That's how many it can hold. The orbitals outside of that, okay, can hold up to 8. Okay, so I'm drawing carbon here terribly, but I'm doing it. So carbon has 6 protons, which means it also has 6 electrons. So when you draw your electrons on your Bohr model here, what you want to do is start with the inner shell, draw your first electron here, your second electron there. Okay, and then the other 4 are going to be in this outer level. Okay, because there are vacancies here, this outer shell we call a valence shell. And this is the outer orbital shell, which contains valence electrons. Okay. I can't move that, I don't know why. So your valence electrons, so your carbon molecule has 6 total electrons, but it only has 4 valence electrons because those are the outermost electrons. Okay, so because it only has 4 here, this makes carbon an unstable element. Stable elements are elements that have a full valence shell. So it doesn't matter how many electrons it has. If it only has 2 electrons, then it will have a full valence shell because it's only got this. Now, if this element had 8 electrons in its valence shell, then it's stable and it's less likely to react. So when you have elements that have less, that do not have a full valence shell, those are the elements that are going to be involved in chemical bonds more readily because they're unstable. And if you remember our property of life about everything needing to be balanced and in homeostasis, it's the same for this. Those electrons that are those elements want to be stable, so that makes them more highly reactive the less valence electrons they have. Okay, and we'll talk about chemical bonding later. Oh, here we go. Okay, so how do we interact with these things? Okay, so your atoms connect and disconnect. Okay, those are your chemical reactions. We'll talk about the energy required to make those chemical bonds and break those chemical bonds later. But there is an energy involved there. These are dependent on the number and arrangement of electrons. So there's a wide variety of chemical bonds in our everyday life. When you see rust happening, how your digestion happens, photosynthesis, baking, washing your hands, any of these things, these are all chemical reactions that are taking place. And everything is based on these chemical reactions. Okay, so this is what I was talking about with those complex orbitals. So you see that there's these 3 different kinds of orbitals here. So these are 3D, right? They're moving all over the place in different, well, not all over the place, within specific orbitals. You don't need to worry about these for this class. But this is kind of cool. This is what it looks like when electrons are bouncing around all outside of the nucleus. These are negatively charged again, which means that they repel each other, just like magnets, right? So you have your negative charge and positive charge are attracted to one another, and like charges split up or repel each other. Okay, so they're negatively charged, they repel each other, and they're attracted to protons, right? And they move in these orbitals. This is a really cool interactive link here. If you want to go look more about how electrons work, go ahead and click on this link. And there's a cool demonstration of that. So again, I just talked about the octet rule, but each orbital has a maximum number of electrons it can hold at any one time. Okay, the first shell, it's what we call the shell, holds a maximum of 2, and then the shells, the concentric shells out from there all hold 8. So that's why it's called the octet rule. Octet meaning 8. Okay, so here's your second shell, maximum of 8. Okay, these electrons have more energy than the electrons in the first shell. And the most stable condition, again, is the outermost shell is filled with electrons. So these electrons out here, these are called valence electrons. So when I ask for you to tell me how many valence electrons something has, that's what I'm asking. I'm not asking for the total number. I'm asking for the outer number. So once you figure out how many electrons you have based on the atomic number, then you can draw these concentric circles, right? And tell me how many electrons are on the outside shell, the valence shell, and those are your valence electrons, okay? So here's your Bohr shell models for some different elements. Sodium here, right? You have 11 protons here, chlorine, argon. So build your atoms interactive activity that you're going to do, you're going to be building them out, and that's what you're doing. You're putting electrons in these shells and protons and neutrons in the nucleus to show the atom. Okay. Here's our buddy oxygen down here, and carbon, right? 6. So we already drew carbon before, but there it is. Okay, so if you have unfilled shells, again, those atoms are going to be more likely to react with another element because they're always looking to have those shells full. Okay. Shells that are full are chemically unreactive. Okay, so like helium Helium is not a reactive element because it has its valence shell is full. It's got two, it only has two electrons, and that fills the shell. So it's an unreactive element. You can do these quizzes on your own. This is a good way to make sure that you're understanding the material. Yeah. All right, important atoms in biology, four atoms that comprise 96% of all living things. That's hydrogen, carbon, nitrogen, and oxygen. Okay, you will see all of these elements in all living things. So these are the chemical or the Bohr models of each of those elements. Okay, so now that we understand the way that the individual atom looks, let's talk about different bonds, the way that these atoms interact to form molecules. We have three main types that we're covering in this class. Metallic bonds we don't talk about here, but those are another type. So we have ionic bonds, covalent bonds, and hydrogen bonds. Those are the main ones that we're going to talk about. Your ionic bonds are going to transfer these electrons. Okay, so basically what happens and we're going to go through all of these. But ionic bonds are using the attraction between negative and positive, but once an atom transfers its electrons. Okay, your covalent bonds are going to be sharing electrons, and then your hydrogen bonds are these partial interactions between elements, and we'll talk about that. So let's look at these. Right, an ion is something that is a charged element. So that means that it has either an overall positive charge. If it has a positive charge, it's called a cation. If it is a negative charge, it's called an anion. Okay, so positive is cation. Negative is anion. So that's what we call those two. So when an element loses or gains an electron, it becomes electrically charged, and that's called an ion. So that's why we call them ionic bonds, because an ionic bond is between two ions. So you're completely transferring electrons from one element to the other. And this is most common when an atom's outermost orbital contains just one or two electrons and needs just one to be filled. Okay. The example here that is very common is NaCl. And if you don't know what that is, it's salt, table salt. Makes food taste good. So your sodium atom here, if you notice, has this valence electron that's all by itself, which means that it's very unstable. Okay. And chlorine over here has a vacancy here. So it's missing one. So what happens is this electron moves into chlorine to make it chloride. Okay. There it is, making this molecule, your sodium, a cation or positive, and making this one negative. And that's because you're moving one electron, which remember has a negative charge to it. So when you move it to another element, that element is now going to have a more negative charge. And the element that is losing the electron is losing that negative charge, so it's going to become more positive. So an ionic bond is, once that is transferred over, there's now a change in charge. Okay, so this sodium ion is going to be positive charge, and this chloride ion is negatively charged. And so the bond is formed because of this difference in charge, like a magnet. Okay. So there's your salt. And the way that these atoms end up interacting together with these different charges for salt specifically, they end up forming a crystal structure. So these little salt crystals that you see, that's because of this interaction between these different ions. The way they interact ends up forming a crystalline structure, which is pretty cool. Not all ions that bond together, not all ionic bonds end up in crystalline figurations, like configurations, but the salt does. Okay. Covalent bonds. These are the sharing of electrons. Okay, so a lot of elements share electrons, which results in a stronger bond. So out of all of the bonds, your covalent bonds are the strongest. Okay, so you have covalent bonds are the strongest, ionic bonds are next, and then your hydrogen bonds are the weakest. That just means the when we talk about strength of the bond, we're talking about how much energy does it take to break that molecule apart. Two or more atoms that are held together by a covalent bond form a molecule. Okay, so this is how your molecules, a lot of your molecules are formed. Here's some examples here. Okay. Also, if you're curious, when we ask for molecular formulas, this is what we're asking for, the actual element symbols. If we're asking for structural formulas, we ask for these line structures. These line structures tell us that these atoms are bonded to one another. And then if we asked for electron sharing diagrams or Bohr models, we're asking for these concentric circles. Okay, we won't be asking for a lot of things like this in class, but just as a refresher. So when I start using different vocabulary, you don't get lost. Okay, so we have a couple of different kinds of covalent bonds that we'll go over, but in general, you can have a single, double, or triple covalent bond. The more bonds there are involved, like a triple covalent bond is going to be stronger than a single bond. Okay. And two, that they again, they're sharing these electrons. Your two atoms can share these electrons in two different ways. There are two types of covalent bonds. You have a non-polar covalent bond, and then you have a polar covalent bond. Your non-polar covalent bond are atoms that share electrons equally. Okay, so you can see you've got your top one up here. They're sharing your hydrogen bond here or equally. Okay. Your polar bonds, those are electrons that are shared unequally. Okay, and that it means that one end of the molecule is going to be slightly more negative, and the other end of the molecule is going to be slightly more positive. And we're going to talk about this as it pertains to water in just a minute. So your polar molecule has a temporary separation of charge. So what does that look like? What does that mean? Remember that your electrons are moving around the center of the atom all the time. So what happens is when we have these charges here, this weird looking symbol means partial. So this means that this is a partial negative, okay? This partial positive, partial positive. So what's happening in your water molecules is you have the electrons are spending more time towards the oxygen element than they are towards the hydrogen element because they're moving around. Okay. This oxygen is what we call an electronegative element. So when hydrogen bonds to it, then the electrons spend more time around the oxygen, meaning that that part of the molecule is going to be more partially negative. Okay. Because it's not spending all of its time there, right? But it's spending a lot more time towards the oxygen element. So your hydrogen, because those electrons are being pulled more, have these partial positive charges. And this is one of the reasons why water is such a unique molecule, because these partial negative and partial positive charges, that's what creates a lot of the properties of water. Water is a really, really unique and interesting molecule. We have lots of different properties that allow it to be adhesive to things, cohesive with things, hydrogen bonds between it. It's has a lower density frozen than it does in liquid form. There's just a lot about it that really makes it a very important molecule to life. Water is the key to living things. We need water to survive in so many ways. Okay. So this is called a polar covalent bond. And this is the bond between the hydrogen and the oxygen. And that's because these electrons are being shared unequally. Okay, the electron density is greatest around the electron atom. So that's why those partial charges exist. Okay, then the next and last bond we will be covering is called the hydrogen bond. And your hydrogen bond is the weakest of all of them, okay? But it is used in a ton of different biological functions. So not only does it hold water together, but it also is responsible for the folding of proteins, which we'll talk about later, and the backbone for DNA. There's a ton of ways that hydrogen bonds are used in biology. So this partial and all a hydrogen bond is it is a bond between a hydrogen atom and one that is an atom that is more electronegative. So that is that oxygen and nitrogen and fluorine or fluoride, I think is the other ones. But oxygen and nitrogen are ones specifically that are highly electronegative, which means that the it creates that partial charge that allows for these weak interactions. So hydrogen bonds, so your polar covalent bonds are the bonds that are holding the water molecule together. Your hydrogen bonds are the bonds between water molecules. Okay, so this partially negative charge here, right, connects weakly with this partially positive charge of the hydrogen of another water molecule. So your hydrogen bonds are between water molecules. Your polar covalent bonds are within the water molecule. Okay, so again, because of their polarity, they're attracted. This partial charge is what is creating that hydrogen bond there. But there is no movement of electrons between the water molecules themselves. Okay, the hydrogen bond is just between that partial charge there. Okay, so oxygen, nitrogen, and hydrogen atoms, biological systems, these are very common in a lot of biological contexts. So here's some example, again, protein folding, and then your backbones and DNA. We'll talk about protein folding later, but you can see here, there's a hydrogen bond here. Okay, there's an ionic bond here. Okay, but these hydrogen bonds there, and then you have hydrogen bonds between the two strands of your DNA. So very important and common in a lot of biological molecules. Cellulose is another example. We'll talk more about cellulose in the lecture about biomolecules, but your cellulose is the most common carbohydrate on the planet, and it is found in plant walls, in plant cell walls. Okay, so you can see all of these dotted lines here. These are all hydrogen bonds. So the chain of cellulose is held together by your hydrogen bonds. All right. That is it for the basic chemistry of life. Yay. So the next lecture you'll be watching is about biomolecules. I'm going to split that lecture into two so that you have introduction to biomolecules, and then we'll do carbohydrates and lipids together, and then I'll do a separate lecture on nucleic acids and proteins in one bunch. Okay? See you guys later.